On the morning of October 25, 1944, off Samar, the battle off Samar began to show its true character. Taffy 3 was not a line of fleet carriers and battleships. It was an escort carrier task unit, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, in the wider Leyte Gulf battle, one of the largest naval battles ever fought. Nearly 200,000 men and 282 ships were spread across roughly 100,000 square miles. That scale mattered because when Taffy 3 met the Japanese center force, the mismatch in weight and armor was immediate. On the decks, the day still looked like work. Aircraft sat in rows, crewmen moved between stations. Signals were passed. In the command spaces, watchstanders tracked contacts and relayed what they could while the ship kept its own steady rhythm. Around the task unit, the sea was open and gray, the horizon wide, and every ship had a job to do. The carriers had to launch and recover aircraft. The destroyers and destroyer escorts had to screen them. The whole formation depended on timing, discipline, and the simple ability to keep moving. That ordinary motion mattered, because the ships did not begin the morning as legends. They began it as working vessels, with people at gun mounts, signal positions, bridge wings, and flight deck stations. Below, the machinery spaces kept the ships moving. Above, the deck crews kept the air operations in motion. The fight would come down to whether that system could hold together long enough to matter. Every deck movement, every signal, and every decision had to preserve enough order to keep the formation coherent for one more minute under pressure. There was no room for ceremony. There was only routine, compressed into a narrow margin of time. Then came the unexpected contact. The Japanese force had come through San Bernardino Strait and into the waters off Samar, where Taffy 3 was already on station. The first minutes were about recognition, speed, and survival. There was no time for a clean battle plan. There was only the fight to buy time. USS Johnston, under Ernest E. Evans, answered first in the sharpest way a destroyer could. Johnston launched a torpedo attack and moved to help screen the escort carriers with smoke. Smoke changed the picture on the water. It broke sight lines. It made the carriers harder to range. It gave the smaller ships a few more moments to maneuver, to turn, to launch, and to keep the air operations going. Johnston's attack did not erase the danger, but it forced the enemy to deal with a threat that had no business being that close to battleships. Heermen joined the destroyer screen as well, laying smoke and staying in the line that kept the escort carriers from being overrun. In the same confused space, Hoel entered the close-range fight and took severe damage before she was lost. Samuel B. Roberts followed into the action and met the same fate after a hard, unequal fight. These were not abstract names on a map. They were ships with crews at their stations, moving under fire, trying to hold a line that should never have been theirs to hold. The air battle did not stand still either. Aircraft from Taffy 3 kept coming, and aircraft from Taffy 2 added their own pressure. Even when the loads they carried were improvised, the effect was the same. The center force had to fight in more than one direction at once. That is the shape of the morning, not a single blow, but a continuing series of threats from the sea and the air, each one buying time for the task unit that was trying not to break. Gambier Bay became another symbol of that morning. The escort carrier was overwhelmed in the action and sank on October 25th. From the flight decks of Taffy 3 and from Taffy 2 as well, aircraft kept coming in. That detail matters because it shows the pressure of the fight. It was not a single dramatic strike. It was smoke, torpedoes, air attacks, and the stubborn refusal of small ships and carrier crews to quit the field. In the hours that followed, the Japanese forces' picture of the battle broke apart under resistance, air attack, confusion, and incomplete situational awareness. The battle would become a lasting example of initiative under extreme pressure. And Johnston's story did not end with the morning action. Her wreck was later located and filmed, a quiet reminder that the record of that day still rests on the seafloor. This was the morning Taffy 3 met battleships, and it began with a small task unit, a wide gray sea, and crews who went to their stations knowing the odds and fighting anyway. To understand the battle off Samar, start with the unit itself. Taffy 3 was not a line of fleet carriers and battleships. It was an escort carrier task unit made up of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. In the larger Leyte Gulf operation, one of the largest naval battles ever fought, that was the shape of the force: light carriers, thin escorts, and a wide battle space that stretched far beyond the horizon. That kind of task unit would not look like a steel wall. It would look like motion and routine, for as long as routine held. A carrier flight deck with aircraft parked close together. Deck crews moving carefully around tie-downs and handling gear. A cramped command room with radios, charts, and men bent over their stations. On the destroyers, sailors at the bridge, at the guns, and at the equipment they would need if trouble came fast. The sea around them was broad and gray, with wakes crossing under a low sky. This was a working formation, not a battle line built to trade blows with heavy ships. That is what makes Taffy 3 so important. It was small, but it was real. Its strength was not in armor or gun caliber. Its strength was in the fact that it was already doing the work of a carrier task unit when the enemy appeared. The ships were in position, the aircraft were aboard, the crews were at their posts, and the formation was ready to operate in the middle of a much larger campaign. On the morning of October 25, 1944, the Japanese center force came out from San Bernardino Strait and unexpectedly found Taffy 3 in its path off Samar. In that moment, the character of the force changed. What had been one supporting task unit in a major operation suddenly had to act like the last barrier between the enemy and the American carriers. USS Johnston, under Commander Ernest E. Evans, moved first in the destroyer fight. It launched a torpedo attack and helped screen the carriers with smoke. Airmen also laid smoke and remained part of the destroyer screen that kept the escort carriers from being overrun. Hoel and Samuel B. Roberts joined the close-range fight and were lost after severe damage. Gambier Bay was overwhelmed and sank during the action. Aircraft from Taffy 3 and Taffy 2 attacked and harassed the center force, even when the crews had to improvise what they carried. None of those actions alone decided the battle, but together they slowed, distracted, and complicated the Japanese advance. That is why Taffy 3 matters. Taffy 3 was not mythic because of its size. It was ordinary in structure and extraordinary in the moment. It had flight decks, command spaces, bridge watches, crew stations, radios, charts, and aircraft handling gear. It had ships that were meant to work together and crews who had to make those ships count under pressure. When the enemy arrived, every part of that small formation mattered. The carriers had to keep launching. The escorts had to keep screening. The destroyers had to keep pressing close enough to buy time. The destroyer escorts had to stay in the fight as long as they could. In the broader scale of Leyte Gulf, that mattered even more. The battle involved nearly 200,000 men and 282 ships across roughly 100,000 square miles. In that vast space, Taffy 3 was a small task unit, but it was the one that met the center force off Samar. That is why the story keeps its force. Not because the unit was made of giants, but because the men aboard those ships did ordinary naval work under extraordinary pressure. So when you picture Taffy 3, picture the actual thing. Picture the flight deck, the destroyer bridge, the command room, the crew at their stations, the sea state rolling under a gray sky, and the movement of ships and aircraft across a formation that was built to operate, then forced to fight. Picture 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Picture the Japanese force emerging from the strait and finding them there. That is what Taffy 3 actually was. Before the shells and torpedoes, it still looked like a support operation moving through a rough sea state. On the escort carriers, crew worked at stations, on the deck, and in the command room, checking equipment, handling stores, and keeping the small logistics motion of a carrier task unit alive. Aircraft were still being managed. Reports were still moving. From the inside, every station mattered, because this was a formation built for support, not to absorb a surface attack. Taffy 3 was 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. It sat inside Leyte Gulf, part of a battle so large it stretched across roughly 100,000 square miles, involved nearly 200,000 men, and put 282 ships into the fight. That scale mattered in the histories. In the moment, the men on those ships only saw the narrow strip of water ahead and the changing reports on the bridge and in the command room. They were facing a horizon, a task unit, and a set of ships that were about to be tested in the worst possible way. In the morning, the Japanese center force came out of San Bernardino Strait and unexpectedly found Taffy 3 in the Philippine Sea battle space. The contact was sudden. The horizon that had looked empty was no longer empty. The carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts were suddenly faced with a force they had not been built to meet on equal terms. Reports came in fragments, bearings, silhouettes, and urgency, and then the recognition that the battle had changed shape in a single moment. On the carriers, men at crew stations shifted from routine to emergency. Deck crews kept moving aircraft, gear, and ammunition as long as they could, while radios, signal gear, and command spaces filled with reports. The sea stayed rough, and the wind, smoke, and noise made every movement harder. What had been ordinary logistical motion became part of the defense. Every minute gained mattered. Every bit of motion on the deck, from a handoff to a signal to a machine being readied, now had a purpose beyond routine. USS Johnston, under Ernest E. Evans, broke from the screen and launched a torpedo attack. Johnston also helped cover the carriers with smoke, buying them a little more room and a little more time. Heerman was there too, laying smoke and staying with the destroyer screen. The smoke was not a perfect shield. It was a moving blur that made the enemy work harder to see, aim, and choose. These were not grand gestures. They were close, dangerous acts carried out under overwhelming firepower, with small ships placing themselves between the escort carriers and the enemy force. Then Hoel and Samuel B. Roberts joined the close-range fight. Both were heavily damaged and lost. The escort carrier Gambier Bay was overwhelmed and sank during the action on 25 October 1944. The fight was now about delay, disruption, and survival. Taffy 3 had no way to turn the encounter into a fair fight. It could only make the Japanese advance cost more than it was expected to cost, and each ship that moved forward did so knowing exactly what it might lose. Aircraft from Taffy 3 attacked as they could, and aircraft from Taffy 2 joined them, harassing the center force even with improvised ordnance. The attacks did not need to be decisive to matter. They added pressure, confusion, and the steady sense that resistance was still coming from every direction. Smoke, torpedoes, aircraft, and the determination of the destroyer screen all worked together to make the battlefield harder to read. Crews were adapting in real time because the situation left them no other choice. Kurita's withdrawal did not come from one single blow. It came from confusion, resistance, air attack, and incomplete situational awareness. The center force had run into a defense that was smaller than it expected and far more dangerous than it had judged. The American ships were not where they were supposed to be in the enemy's picture. They were where the battle had forced them to stand, and that was enough to alter the outcome of the moment. The contact had become more than contact. It had become a test of endurance. Long after the action, Johnston's wreck was later located and filmed, a reminder that this was not a mythic stand invented after the fact. It was a real encounter, fought by real ships and real crews in one of the largest naval battles ever fought. The contact that changed everything was not a single dramatic moment. It was the point at which routine became survival, and survival became history. It still looks like a support mission. On the escort carriers, crews work at deck stations and in the command room, checking equipment, moving stores, and keeping the ships in order as they ride a rough sea. In the broad battle space off Samar, Taffy 3 is not built for a fleet engagement. It is an escort carrier task unit of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Its job is to support the landings, to launch aircraft, and to keep moving through a dangerous ocean under wartime pressure. Then, the routine breaks. From San Bernardino Strait, the Japanese center force comes out where it is not expected, and suddenly, the ships of Taffy 3 are facing a far larger threat than their stationing or their size would suggest. What had been a support operation becomes a fight for survival. The carriers are still carrying out flight deck work. The destroyer screen is still in motion, and the crews are still trying to keep the formation together, but now every action has to be made under fire. Johnston takes the lead. Under Ernest E. Evans, the destroyer moves first into the crisis, pressing forward with a torpedo attack and helping cover the carriers with smoke. That smoke matters because it buys time. It gives the escort carriers a little more room to maneuver. It gives the crews another chance to keep their stations, to recover their balance, and to keep the task unit from being overrun at once. Johnston is not acting alone, but it is Johnston that sets the pace of resistance. That first move forces the Japanese ships to react. And reaction is exactly what the American screen needs in order to keep distance, break rhythm, and stay alive for a little longer. Behind and beside her, the rest of the screen follows the only course available. Kierman lays smoke as well and remains in the destroyer screen, helping hold the line in front of the carriers. Hoel comes into the close-range fight. Samuel B. Roberts joins it too. These are not abstract names on a chart now. They are ships in the same sea state, under the same pressure, trying to do the same impossible work. Their sacrifice is measured in the damage they absorb and the time they help create for everyone else. The carrier aircraft keep coming in from above. Pilots from Taffy 3 and Taffy 2 attack and harass the center force, even with improvised ordnance. They are not delivering a clean, decisive knockout. They are adding confusion, forcing reactions, and keeping pressure on ships that are already trying to fight through smoke, distance, and resistance from the American screen. In a battle this large, every interruption matters. That larger battle is Leyte Gulf, one of the largest naval battles ever fought. And Samar is one of the sharpest points in it. The scope is enormous. But what mattered here was immediate and intimate. A deck crew working under strain, a command room trying to keep order, stores moving by hand, equipment being handled as the ships pitch, and then the sudden shift from routine motion to emergency action. The sea does not stop because the enemy has appeared. The work continues because the work itself becomes part of the fight. The pressure on the Japanese force does not come from one source. Kurita's withdrawal should be understood as a mix of confusion, resistance, air attack, and incomplete situational awareness. The Americans are not winning by a single dramatic blow. They are making the advance costly, uncertain, and harder to read from the bridge. That is what Johnston's lead represents, not a myth, but a sequence of hard choices made under fire, where every destroyer screen, every smoke laydown, and every aircraft attack adds another layer of friction to the Japanese advance. Gambier Bay is overwhelmed and sinks during the action on 25 October 1944. The loss is a reminder that courage does not change the balance by itself. The escort carriers are still outgunned. The destroyers are still exposed. But the formation has not folded. It has delayed, disrupted, and survived long enough to matter. Johnston's opening move helped define that response, and the rest of the screen kept the story moving forward. In the years that followed, Johnston's wreck would be located and filmed, bringing the battle back into view in a different way. The steel is gone from the surface now, but the record remains. What happened off Samar was not a legend built after the fact. It was a real action fought by real crews in real ships, and Johnston's lead was the moment the fight on the escort carrier screen became part of naval history. Smoke can turn a small force into a moving wall, but off Samar that wall had to be built under fire. On the escort carriers, the work looked ordinary. Men at deck stations, hands on lines and gear, checks on equipment, stores moving across the deck, and officers in the command room keeping order in a rough sea. The ships rode hard in the sea state, and it still looked like a support mission, even as the larger battle tightened around it. The crew could not yet know how the fight would unfold. They only had the evidence in front of them. That force was Taffy 3, the escort carrier task unit that faced the Japanese center force on 25 October 1944. It included 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. In the wider Battle of Lake Gulf, one of the largest naval battles ever fought, the scale was immense. At Samar, the enemy force came out through San Bernardino Strait and into the Philippine Sea battle space, and a support task unit was being forced into a surface action. The carriers were not built to fight a line of battle duel. Their aircraft supported troops ashore and hunted submarines, while the task unit depended on speed, discipline, and a thin screen of escorts. Once the Japanese ships appeared, every station mattered. Flight deck crews, gun crews, signalmen, and bridge watchstanders all became part of the same emergency, with the command room tracking what could still be launched and what could still be saved. The first answer was smoke. USS Johnston, under Ernest E. Evans, moved first and moved hard. She launched a torpedo attack and helped screen the carriers with smoke. The smoke did not erase the threat, but it changed the picture, masking movement and buying the smaller ships a few more moments to maneuver. That time was enough to let them keep moving under cover. Heermann also laid smoke and remained part of the destroyer screen that kept the escort carriers from being overrun. In the same close action, Hoel and Samuel B. Roberts joined the fight at close range. Both ships were struck hard, severely damaged, and lost. Their actions were practical, immediate, and dangerous, carried out against overwhelming force to protect the carriers behind them. The screen was the last barrier between the escort carriers and the heavier guns. As the destroyers worked the screen, the deck scenes on the escort carriers remained part of the story. Men still moved gear, hands still handled ammunition, checked fittings, and reset equipment where they could. The logistics motion of a ship at war never stopped completely. Even under attack, there were lines to secure, damage to assess, and stations to keep manned. In the command room, the problem was holding the unit together long enough for the fight to remain survivable. That is the texture the footage should hold, not a distant montage, but the daily business of shipboard survival under attack. Aircraft from Taffy 3 and Taffy 2 added pressure as well. They attacked and harassed the center force whenever they could, sometimes with improvised ordnance. Their efforts were not a single decisive blow, but they mattered. Every aircraft that got airborne forced the Japanese force to react, adding confusion, delay, and strain. That pressure kept the center force from settling into an easy rhythm. Gambier Bay was overwhelmed and sank during the action on 25 October. That loss marked how severe the engagement had become for the escort carriers. These were support ships pushed into a brutal surface action, yet their crews fought with the tools they had. They were built to support the fleet, not to meet a surface force at close range. They became part of naval history because they held their places while the situation was still unfolding. Kurita's later withdrawal should be understood as a mix of confusion, resistance, air attack, and incomplete situational awareness. There is no single clean explanation that captures the whole decision. The battle off Samar was real and fragmented, with the smoke line, the destroyer attacks, the carrier aircraft, and the damage inflicted in the fight all feeding the uncertainty that surrounded the Japanese force. No one-ship action explains the withdrawal by itself. The record did not end with the battle itself. Johnston's wreck was later located and filmed, keeping the ship tied to the place where she fought and fell. The smoke, spray, and wreck site keep the historical record concrete. Off Samar was not a legend built after the fact. It was a real action, fought by real crews and real ships, and the destroyer screen that formed in smoke and spray was the moment the escort carrier fight became part of naval history. Hoel kept the fight close because that was the only kind of fight Taffy 3 could make. On 25 October 1944, Taffy 3 was a small escort carrier task unit in the larger Battle of Lake Gulf. It included 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. When the Japanese center force came out of San Bernardino Strait, it unexpectedly found those ships in the Philippine Sea battle space. There was no battle line waiting to meet it. There was a thin screen, a flight deck organization in motion, and crews who had to turn routine carrier work into combat work without pause. The scale of the wider battle matters because it shows how small the screen was. Leyte Gulf was one of the largest naval battles ever fought, with nearly 200,000 men and 282 ships spread across roughly 100,000 square miles. But off Samar, the view collapsed to what the eye could actually hold: smoke, wakes, turning ships, and the narrow strip of water where a destroyer could keep itself in front of a much heavier force. That is why the story stays close to the deck, the bridge, and the people moving through the ship. The first thing to understand is shipboard life-changing and real-time. Men move to stations. Lines are secured. Gear is passed hand to hand. In the command room, bearings, reports, and orders move quickly through cramped space while the bridge keeps the ship turning. On deck, the sea looks gray and hard, with spray breaking across the bow and smoke beginning to hang over the water. The destroyer is not trying to look heroic. It is trying to stay alive in the right place, at the right distance, for as long as possible. Johnston had already surged forward under Ernest E. Evans, launching a torpedo attack and laying smoke to help screen the carriers. Hoel joined that same close fight. Heerman was also in the screen, laying smoke and remaining part of the line that kept the escort carriers from being overrun. The destroyers were not there to match the Japanese force ship per ship. They were there to make every approach harder, every sighting less clear, and every minute closer to the carriers more expensive than the enemy wanted to spend. That is what a destroyer screen can do when it has no margin left. The air groups added their own pressure. Aircraft from Taffy 3 and Taffy 2 came in repeatedly, attacking and harassing the center force with improvised ordnance. They were not delivering a neat, decisive blow. They were adding confusion, noise, and disruption to a battle already overloaded with smoke, turning ships and overlapping reports. That kind of pressure matters because it complicates the enemy's picture of the fight. It makes speed feel less certain. It makes distance harder to judge. It makes a tight formation harder to hold. If the footage were silent for a moment, the ship itself would still tell the story. A gun crew at station, a signalman working in the open air, a messenger moving through a passageway, a bridge team focused on the next turn. Below, the practical motions of naval life continue even under fire. Equipment stowed, reports relayed, damage assessed, hands ready where they are needed. The work is orderly because disorder would be fatal. Every movement is part of keeping the ship in the fight, even while the fight is trying to tear the ship apart. Hoel pressed into that space and took severe damage. Samuel B. Roberts joined the same close-range fight and was also lost. Gambier Bay was overwhelmed and sank during the action. None of this was a matter of one ship single-handedly winning the day. It was a matter of small ships staying in front of a larger force long enough to keep the carriers moving and the battle from collapsing at once. The destroyers kept the fight close because close was the only distance that still bought time. That pressure helped shape what came next. Kurita's withdrawal was not the result of a single cause. It came from confusion, resistance, air attack, and an incomplete picture of what he was facing. Hoel's story belongs inside that larger decision, but it also stands on its own. The ship history record keeps the Samar chronology clear. A destroyer entering the close fight, absorbing damage, and ending in loss. It is the record of a ship that closed the range, held the line as long as it could, and absorbed the consequences of doing exactly what the moment demanded. That is the practical meaning of Hoel's fight, time bought under fire for the ships behind her in that moment. Hoel had already shown what Taffy 3 could do when the fight closed to point-blank distance. Samuel B. Roberts entered the same struggle as part of the small screen built around 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. That screen was all that stood between the Japanese center force and the carriers when the enemy force came out of San Bernardino Strait and unexpectedly found the task unit in the Philippine Sea battlespace, in the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf. That was enough to turn an ordinary morning into a test of nerve, speed, and coordination. On the water, the scene was all wake, smoke, and gray steel. On deck, crews stayed at their stations. In the command room, the work narrowed to bearings, signals, and the next order that had to be passed without delay. Samuel B. Roberts did not have the luxury of distance. It had to join a fight that was closing faster than anyone wanted, and it had to do it in company with ships that were already under heavy pressure. Johnston had launched her torpedo attack and helped screen the carriers with smoke. Heermann also laid smoke and remained part of the destroyer screen. Those ships were not trying to win the battle by themselves. They were trying to keep the carriers alive long enough for aircraft to keep coming off the decks. That is what the close-range fight looked like from the inside. A destroyer moving through spray and smoke, a bridge crowded with voices and instrument readings, a crew shifting between gun stations, ready lockers, and damaged gear, and all of it happening while the ship was under fire from a force much larger than itself. Every move had to be made in the open, with the sea breaking under the hull and the horizon disappearing in bursts of smoke. Hoel and Samuel B. Roberts both joined that close-range fight and were lost after severe damage. That is the hard arithmetic of Samar. The destroyer escorts could not stop the entire center force, but they could force the attack to become chaotic, costly, and slow. Gambier Bay was overwhelmed and sank during the action on 25 October 1944. Even so, the air battle did not stop. Aircraft from Taffy 3 and Taffy 2 pressed in against the Japanese ships and harassed the center force with improvised ordnance. The effect was not neat, and it was not decisive in a single stroke, but it added pressure at the exact moment pressure mattered. Here, the deck work matters most. Men moving along narrow passageways, a gun crew at a station, a signalman working through smoke, a chart table lit in a cramped command space, and the outer deck heaving as the sea state keeps the ship in motion. The battle was being fought from every exposed position on board. Kurita's withdrawal did not come from one cause alone. It grew out of confusion, resistance, air attack, and incomplete situational awareness. That is why the story of Samuel B. Roberts matters. The ship did not have to survive to have an effect. It had to get close, stay in the fight, and make the enemy commit time and attention that could not be spent somewhere else. Taffy 3 was a small escort carrier task unit, but on that morning it became a moving wall of smoke, aircraft, and destroyer action. The operational context was large, but the human scale was immediate. Hands on rails, voices in a command room, engines pushing through spray, and men at crew stations carrying out the next task without waiting for certainty. The battle off Samar remains one of the clearest examples of what determined crews can do when they are outgunned and still have something left to give. Samuel B. Roberts belongs in that record because it joined the close fight and paid the price for it. In the larger frame, Leyte Gulf was one of the largest naval battles ever fought. A clash measured not only in ships and men, but in the pressure it placed on every decision at sea. That scale matters because it shows why the resistance of Taffy 3 had the effect it did. The Japanese force met smoke, torpedoes, harassing air attack, and a screen of small ships that held together under pressure. The outcome was not the product of a single move. It was the result of confusion, resistance, air attack, and incomplete situational awareness pressing on the Japanese commander at the same time. Samuel B. Roberts stands in that moment as proof that close-range fighting could still shape a larger operation for the ships behind it and the battle beyond. The story then turns from the close surface action to the air war above it. Off Samar on 25 October 1944, Taffy 3 was the escort carrier task unit that met the Japanese center force. It was a small formation built around 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, and it was suddenly the force in the path of the Japanese center force. The scale of the surrounding battle was immense, but the moment on these decks was immediate, cramped, and urgent. On the flight decks, nothing could be treated as routine anymore. Men at crew stations kept moving through the roll of the ship and the motion of the gray sea, working around aircraft, lines, radios, and the constant need to keep one task finished before the next began. In the command room, reports came in as fragments rather than a full picture. A carrier deck under attack is a place where timing matters more than ceremony, and where every launch, every recovery, and every handoff has to happen while the horizon itself is changing. On a ship like this, The work chain runs from the lookout to the bridge, from the bridge to the command room, from the command room back to the deck, and every step depends on the next one. That is why the smoke screen mattered. Under Ernest E. Evans, USS Johnston charged, launched torpedoes, and helped screen the carriers with smoke. Heerman also laid smoke and remained part of the destroyer screen. The destroyers were not trying to win the battle alone. They were trying to buy time, to keep the carriers alive long enough for aircraft to keep going out and coming back in through the haze. The air war above the surface fight was not a separate contest, it was part of the same struggle. Aircraft from Taffy 3 and Taffy 2 attacked and harassed the center force, and when the moment demanded it, they did so with improvised ordnance. That was not a polished display of strike power. It was pressure applied wherever it could be applied, from whatever deck and whatever aircraft could still be made ready. Through smoke, spray, and uncertainty, the aircraft kept coming, and each sortie added to the pressure on the Japanese force. In war, sometimes the most important thing is not a perfect attack, it is the next attack. Below that, the surface fight kept tightening. Hoel and Samuel B. Roberts joined the close-range action and were lost after severe damage. Gambier Bay was overwhelmed and sank during the fight. Each loss deepened the danger to the remaining ships, but it also showed how stubborn the screen had become. The Japanese force was no longer facing a passive escort group. It was facing a formation that had turned survival itself into a weapon. The sea state added its own burden. A deck that is already moving is harder to work, harder to launch from, and harder to read under stress. Spray, smoke, and exhaust blurred the line between the ships and the weather, and the crews had to keep moving stores, gear, and support equipment through that confusion. Nothing about the logistics was glamorous. It was hands, lifts, signals, and repetition. It was the unromantic work that makes flight operations possible when the battle is at its worst. Even the smallest delay could matter, because the deck had to stay open, the aircraft had to stay serviceable, and the next sortie had to be ready when the order came. Within the larger Leyte Gulf battle, one of the largest naval battles ever fought, with nearly 200,000 men and 282 ships spread across roughly 100,000 square miles. This small action still mattered. The center force had run into something it did not expect to find in its path, and once that contact was made, incomplete situational awareness, air attack, smoke, resistance, and confusion all pulled on the same decision-making chain. From the bridge, from the command room, and from the flight deck, nobody had the luxury of a complete answer. They only had the next report, the next launch, and the next order. That is the real shape of the battle. The air war above the surface fight did not erase the cost below it, and it did not turn the battle into something clean. It simply widened the pressure on the enemy while the ships underneath endured. Johnston's wreck was later located and filmed, a later reminder that the battle continued to echo long after the smoke cleared. What remains from this moment is the image of a small carrier unit working through fear and motion, keeping aircraft in the fight while its destroyers and escort ships bought every possible minute. By the time Gambier Bay reached its endgame, the wider battle had already grown beyond ordinary scale. Leyte Gulf was one of the largest naval battles ever fought, spread across roughly 100,000 square miles and involving nearly 200,000 men and 282 ships. That larger frame matters, but it does not soften what happened off Samar. There, on 25 October 1944, Taffy 3 was the escort carrier task unit that met the Japanese center force. It was a small formation, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. On deck, the work is close and practical. Men move between parked aircraft, secured gear, lines, and fittings. The sea lifts under the hull. Below, in the command spaces, voices, bearings, and reports compress into decisions that are already too late for comfort, but still necessary. When the Japanese force emerged from San Bernardino Strait and found Taffy 3 in the Philippine Sea battle space, the task unit had only one answer: motion. The carriers turned. The destroyers moved forward. Smoke began to spread across the water. A signal bridge becomes a place where bearings are relayed. corrected, and relayed again. A chart table becomes the center of gravity. The ship does not stop to explain itself. It simply keeps working. And every crew station takes on a sharper purpose. What was routine a minute earlier is now emergency work carried out in a tight, moving frame of spray, smoke, and confusion. USS Johnston, under Ernest E. Evans, went in first. She launched a torpedo attack and helped screen the carriers with smoke, buying minutes that mattered more than miles. Heerman also laid smoke and remained part of the destroyer screen that helped keep the escort carriers from being overrun. Then, Hoel and Samuel B. Roberts joined the close-range fight. Their sacrifice did not change the scale of the Japanese force, but it did force that force to keep paying for every gain. Both ships were lost after severe damage. In practical terms, that means damage control parties at work, gun crews at their stations, bridge watchstanders trying to hold their bearings, and every surviving ship trying to make itself harder to kill. Gambier Bay was caught in that same pressure. There is no clean pause in the sequence, no neat lines separating one phase from the next. It is smoke, shellfire, maneuver, and repetition. On an escort carrier deck, that would mean aircraft crowded close, crew moving around secured equipment, hoses and lines managed by hand, and every task made harder by the sea state and the violence around it. Below, in the command room, the work becomes a series of priorities. What can be launched? What can be reported, what can be saved, and what must be left behind for the moment, because the moment will not wait. The air war did not stop there. Aircraft from Taffy 3 and aircraft from Taffy 2 kept attacking and harassing the center force, even when they had to use improvised ordnance. That detail matters because it shows the battle as layered pressure rather than a single blow. The planes did not need to finish the Japanese force to matter. They kept it under strain, complicated its movement, and added uncertainty to a fight already crowded with smoke, damage, and partial reports. The flight deck, the hangar, the radio circuits, and the bridge all belong to the same operational picture. Even the logistics motion is part of it. Fuel hoses, ammunition handling, message passing, and the constant effort to keep the ship ready for another launch that may come too soon. Kurita's withdrawal should not be reduced to one cause. It belongs to a mix of confusion, resistance, air attack, and incomplete situational awareness. That mixed explanation fits the battle because the battle itself was mixed. Destroyers charged, carriers launched, smoke screens shifted, reports came in fragments. Men saw only pieces of the whole. They had to act on the next thing in front of them, not on the full map of the fight. That is why Gambier Bay's endgame remains so powerful without becoming myth. The story is concrete. It is a ship, a crew, a horizon cut by smoke, and a task unit holding together under pressure long enough to matter. The records that survive keep that morning grounded. The official histories, the ship histories, and the later discovery and filming of Johnston's wreck all reinforce the historical presence of the battle. Gambier Bay remains part of that same record, not as a legend detached from evidence, but as a ship that was overwhelmed and lost while Taffy 3 held on. In the end, the battle is defined by motion under fire, men at stations, aircraft in the air, smoke over the water, and a small escort carrier force carrying the weight of a much larger battle. By the time the answer to Kurita's withdrawal begins to emerge, Leyte Gulf had already become something far larger than a single engagement. This was one of the largest naval battles ever fought, spread across roughly 100,000 square miles and involving nearly 200,000 men. Inside that vast fight, Taffy 3 was a small escort carrier task unit, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. That composition matters because it tells you the scale mismatch before the first shell burst. On 25 October 1944, the Japanese center force emerged from San Bernardino Strait and found Taffy 3 unexpectedly in the Philippine Sea battlespace. The force that met it was not a passive target. USS Johnston under Ernest E. Evans launched a torpedo attack and helped screen the carriers with smoke. Here men also laid smoke and remained part of the destroyer screen. Hoel and Samuel B. Roberts joined the close-range fight and were lost after severe damage. Gambier Bay was overwhelmed and sank during the action. The battle at this point was not a clean exchange between equal forces. It was a small screen trying to hold a line long enough for everything else to keep moving. Above and around that surface action, aircraft from Taffy 3 and Taffy 2 kept attacking, even with improvised ordnance. Those strikes were not decisive by themselves, but they added pressure, added confusion, and kept the center force under constant harassment from more directions than it could comfortably sort out. In a fight like this, pressure does not have to look perfect to matter. It only has to keep arriving. That is the core of why Kurita withdrew. It was not one clean reason. It was confusion, resistance, air attack, and incomplete situational awareness, all compressed into a fight where smoke hid the horizon and small ships kept reappearing in the wrong places from the Japanese point of view. The picture on the bridge could not stay still long enough to become simple. The commander facing that picture did not have a single neat answer in front of him. He had fragments. A destroyer cuts through a gray sea, spray lifting over the bow, while crewmen hold their stations on deck. In a command room, voices move over circuits, charts, and reports. Equipment is checked, lines are handled, messages move through the ship, and the logistics motion of war never stops, even while the battle rages. That steady motion matters, because it shows how a ship stays in the fight when everything outside is chaos. A deck shot can hold on a gun crew or a signal station, a bridge shot can hold on the strain of reading partial information. A sea shot can hold on the way smoke and spray blur distance until the horizon itself feels unstable. The same logic applies across the larger battle. Leyte Gulf was not just a local clash, it was one of the largest naval battles ever fought, and the larger scale made every decision harder to read from inside the fight. Taffy 3's small carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts were carrying out their mission, while the wider action kept shifting around them. That is why the story of Kurita's withdrawal cannot be told as if one event snapped everything into place. The sources point to a mix of factors, and the mix matters more than any single clean explanation. Kurita did not face a single dramatic blow that explains everything. He faced a battle that would not resolve into a clean picture. Smoke, torpedo runs, destroyer aggression, carrier harassment, and a stubborn American screen made the advance costly and unclear. Even under that pressure, the small ships and their aircraft kept forcing him to read the fight again and again, with less certainty each time. The safe reading is straightforward. The fight was confusing, resistive, and hard to interpret, and that uncertainty helped drive the decision to turn away. The story keeps its power precisely because it stays grounded. Taffy 3 was not a legend built from distance. It was a task unit of escorts, carriers, and air crews under pressure, answering with smoke, torpedoes, sorties, and discipline. That is the historical truth it leaves behind. A commander withdrew not from a single blow, but from a battle that no longer offered him a clear way through. Later, the wreck of Johnston was located and filmed, a reminder that this fight still sits in the historical record, not as legend alone, but as a place where ships, crews, and decisions can still be traced. That is why Kurita withdrew, because the battle had become too confused, too resistant, and too costly to read as a simple path forward. By the time the rescue work and battle reports began to take shape, the morning off Samar was already part of the larger storm of Leyte Gulf. This was not a small action. It belonged to one of the largest naval battles ever fought, a struggle spread across roughly 100,000 square miles and involving nearly 200,000 men and 282 ships. That scale matters because it explains why the record of Taffy 3 is a record built from fragments. Fragments of sight, fragments of signal, fragments of damage, and fragments of survival. On the deck of an escort carrier, the view is cramped and practical. Crew stations stay busy. Equipment has to keep working, and every movement carries the weight of the next report, the next message, the next task. In the command room, Watchstanders and officers do not have the luxury of seeing the whole battle. They see what their own ship can confirm, hear what nearby ships can send, and watch supplies and messages move through narrow passageways under strain. They build a picture from pressure, smoke, sea state, and incomplete information. Taffy 3 itself was an escort carrier task unit made up of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. When the Japanese center force emerged from San Bernardino Strait and entered the Philippine Sea battle space, it found that small unit in its path. The encounter was immediate and overwhelming in scale, but it was not passive. The American ships answered with what they had: movement, smoke, gunfire, message traffic, and a refusal to yield the carriers without a fight. USS Johnston, under Ernest E. Evans, launched a torpedo attack and helped screen the carriers with smoke. That did not stop the Japanese force by itself, but it bought time. And in this kind of fight, time is not a detail. It is a form of rescue. Heermann also laid smoke and remained part of the destroyer screen that kept the escort carriers from being overrun. This is the kind of moment that shows motion under pressure. A destroyer's deck alive with crew stations, line handling, and fast, disciplined work while the sea remains rough around the hull. Hoel and Samuel B. Roberts joined the close-range fight and were lost after severe damage. Their sacrifice belongs at the center of the story, because those ships did not simply appear and vanish. They forced the enemy to react. They bought space for the carriers. They kept the formation from being crushed in the first moments of contact. Gambier Bay was overwhelmed and sank during the action on 25 October 1944, adding another clear marker to the damage ledger of the day. The carriers were not armored battleships, and the morning revealed that vulnerability in full. Aircraft from Taffy 3 and Taffy 2 also attacked and harassed the center force, even when they had to use improvised ordnance. That effort did not turn the battle into a simple air victory. It added another layer of pressure, another reason the Japanese ships could not treat the fight as a clean advance. The story here is not a single dramatic strike. It is a web of resistance, from smoke on the water to aircraft in the air, to destroyers closing the range again and again. Kurita's withdrawal, in the battle reports and the later historical reading of the fight, reflects a mix of confusion, resistance, air attack, and incomplete situational awareness. No single factor fully explains it. The battle had become too complex to read at a glance. What one ship saw was only a slice of the whole. What one commander understood in the moment was shaped by smoke, distance, damage, and the sheer size of the engagement around him. After the firing eased, the work changed. Rescue meant accounting for the crews who survived the destruction of their ships and helping where help could still be given. Damage meant recording what had been hit, what could still move, and what had been lost to the sea. The battle reports had to turn a shattered morning into a coherent record, even though the fight had been scattered across an immense operational space. On the deck, in the crew stations, and in the command rooms, messages and observations had to move through damaged equipment and exhausted hands before they could become the official story. That is why the legacy of Johnston still matters. The ship's wreck was later located and filmed, and the image of the wreck reinforces something the reports already show. This battle did not disappear into abstraction. It remained tied to real ships, real crews, and real choices made under extreme pressure. The record endures because the ships endured long enough to create it, and because the sea kept that record in place. By the time the battle reports were sorted and the smoke had lifted from Samar, Taffy 3 was already becoming more than a set of ship names. It had entered the record as a task unit of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts that met the Japanese center force on 25 October 1944. That record matters because it keeps the morning in its proper scale. This was not a small action. It unfolded inside Leyte Gulf, one of the largest naval battles ever fought, and it unfolded under conditions that turned routine ship handling into survival work. Look first at the ships themselves. An escort carrier deck, crowded with aircraft ready or damaged, was not built for a fight like this. It was a working surface, a flight surface, a place for launch and recovery, maintenance and motion. Yet in the battle off Samar, that deck became part of the defense. Around it were crew stations, gun positions, ready rooms, and the narrow spaces where sailors waited for orders and kept doing their jobs. In archival footage and still images, the naval world appears as it really was: steel, wind, spray, signal flags, hose reels, ammunition hoists, and men moving with purpose across a pitching deck. The Japanese force came out of San Bernardino Strait and found Taffy 3 in the Philippine Sea battlespace unexpectedly. The contact changed the day at once. There was no time for ceremony, no room for theory. The carriers turned, the destroyers moved, and the escorts prepared to make themselves as difficult to target as possible. In the command room, the work was immediate and practical. Reports came in, bearings were taken, orders were passed, and the sea state outside the Hoel kept everything unsettled. A calm bridge in such a moment was not calm at all. It was a place where every decision had to be made, while the ship rolled and the situation tightened. USS Johnston, under Ernest E. Evans, answered that pressure with a torpedo attack and with smoke. That is the right scale of the action, not a myth, not a miracle, but a hard and deliberate effort to buy time for the carriers and the rest of the screen. Smoke drifted across the water and changed sight lines. It hid. It confused. It slowed the Japanese view of the task unit for precious moments. On deck, that meant crew members working through the obscuration, through vibration and spray, through the uncertainty that comes when the horizon disappears behind your own defensive screen. Heermann was also part of that destroyer screen. It laid smoke and remained in the fight as the escort carriers tried to stay alive. Hoel and Samuel B. Roberts pressed into the close-range action as well, and both were lost after severe damage. Their records preserve the same truth in different forms. These were ships and crews driven into combat against overwhelming firepower, and they held the line long enough to matter. That is the meaning of sacrifice here. It is not abstract. It is measured in time, in distance, in the minutes a carrier group needed to keep moving under fire. Gambier Bay was overwhelmed and sank during the action on 25 October 1944. In telling the legacy of the battle, that loss must remain concrete. An escort carrier under attack is not simply a symbol. It is a working ship with men at stations, aircraft on board, compartments below, and the sea pressing all around it. The record of such a vessel helps keep the battle grounded. The bow rises and falls. The flight deck is wet. Hands grip rails. Damage control moves through cramped spaces. Orders have to reach the right people quickly. The ship's ordinary routines become the framework for extraordinary danger. Aircraft from Taffy 3 and Taffy 2 also attacked and harassed the center force, even with improvised ordnance. That detail belongs in the record because it shows how naval air power, ship handling, and improvisation were all part of the same struggle. Planes moved off decks, climbed into the weather, and returned to the fight as best they could. Their attacks were not decisive by themselves, but they added pressure. They added confusion. They added another layer of resistance to a Japanese force that was already meeting unexpected disruption from destroyers, escort carriers, and the broader air battle around Leyte Gulf. Kurita's withdrawal is best understood as a mix of confusion, resistance, air attack, and incomplete situational awareness. No single explanation does full justice to the moment. The sea battle was too large, the contacts too fluid, and the information too imperfect. That uncertainty is part of the historical truth. In the command room, on the bridge, and along the exposed edges of the ships, men were acting inside that uncertainty every minute. The legacy remains, because the record remains. Johnston's wreck was later located and filmed, and that discovery brought the battle back into view without turning it into legend. It confirmed that the ships were real, that the losses were real, and that the sea had held the evidence in place. The wrecks, the photographs, the ship histories, and the battle accounts together keep Taffy 3 from drifting into myth. They keep it where it belongs, in the documentary record of real ships, real crews, and real choices made under extreme pressure. That is the meaning of Taffy 3. not invincibility. Not triumph without cost. It is endurance. It is a destroyer laying smoke while the deck heaves underfoot. It is a crew station still manned after the situation changes. It is a command room trying to make sense of a rapidly closing fight. It is logistics motion under fire, aircraft launching with whatever they can carry, and sailors keeping their tasks as the sea state, the smoke, and the enemy all press in at once. The record endures because the ships endured long enough to create it, and because the sea kept that record in place.